There's a hammer sitting in a small museum in Texas. The handle is wood, but it's halfway turned to stone. The iron head is fused into a chunk of sandstone like it grew there. And here's the problem. According to the rocks surrounding it, this hammer is at least 100,000 years old. Some estimates push it past 300,000, which means it was made before agriculture, before the wheel, before written language. Before, by every account we have, anyone on Earth could forge iron at all. Welcome to the London Hammer. The artifact that, depending on who you ask, is either a complete fraud, a misunderstood rock, or the last surviving fingerprint of a civilization we erased from history. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the entire case. The people who found it, what the metal is actually made of, why mainstream geologists roll their eyes, why creationists won't let it go, and why a couple of NASA-affiliated scientists wrote a paper in 2018 quietly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we've been asking the wrong question this whole time. Let's start with the part nobody disputes. In 1936, in a town called London, yes, London, Texas, population still around 200, a couple by the name of Max and Emma Hahn were walking along Red Creek when they spotted a strange-looking rock. A piece of wood was sticking out of it. They picked it up, took it home, and put it on a shelf, the way you do with anything weird you find on a hike. And there it sat, gathering dust for the better part of a decade. In 1947, their son got curious. He cracked the rock open with a hammer, and what fell out wasn't a fossil, it wasn't a bone, it wasn't a root, it was another hammer. Wooden handle, partly petrified, iron head about the size of your fist, 6 inches long, unmistakably hand-forged, and buried, somehow, inside a rock that, by some accounts, came out of a sandstone formation dating back hundreds of millions of years. We're talking before mammals, before dinosaurs, in some interpretations, long before anything resembling a human being. Now you can already feel the problem, so let's just say it out loud. If that date is right, this object cannot exist. There were no humans 300,000 years ago who could smelt iron. There were no humans, period, who could smelt iron until roughly 3,000 years ago. The timeline of metallurgy is one of the most well-documented stories in archaeology. Iron Age, Bronze Age before that. We know this from thousands of dig sites across 6 continents. So which is wrong, the rock or our entire history of the human species? This is where the case for an ancient lost civilization gets built, and honestly, on the surface, it's compelling. First, the hammer is real. You can drive to Glen Rose, Texas right now and look at it through a glass case at the Creation Evidence Museum. Second, the metal composition is genuinely strange. Lab analysis came back at roughly 96% iron, 2.5% chlorine, and less than 1% sulfur. That chlorine number is the part that gets people excited because modern industrial iron does not contain chlorine. It just doesn't. Whatever this thing is, it didn't come off a Pittsburgh assembly line. Third, the wooden handle is partially carbonized, turning to coal, which usually only happens to wood that's been buried for a very long time. So the case writes itself. Impossible object, impossible chemistry, impossible age. But, and this is where we have to be honest, because the but is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The age of the rock and the age of the thing inside the rock are not the same number. Geologists have a word for this, and the word is concretion. Here's what it means in plain English. If you bury something, anything, in the right kind of mineral-rich soil, water seeps through, deposits minerals around the object, and over time forms a hard stone shell around it. To the naked eye, that shell looks identical to ancient bedrock. To a casual observer, the object looks like it's been sealed in stone since the dawn of time. In reality, the shell might be 80 years old. And this is where the London Hammer's story starts to come apart, because nobody dug it up, Nobody documented its position in a rock layer. Nobody photographed it in place. A couple found a rock on a riverbank and brought it home. That's not an excavation, that's a stroll. In archaeology, context is everything. Strip away the context and you're just holding a thing. There's also the slightly embarrassing matter of what the hammer actually looks like, because if you set it next to a hardware catalog from 1885, it's a perfect match. The size, the head shape, the handle proportions. It is an unmistakable 19th century American mining hammer. The kind miners and farmers across central Texas used by the thousands. The kind that got dropped into cracks and creek beds constantly. Drop one of those into a limestone fissure in 1860. Leave it alone for 80 years in mineral-rich groundwater. And you get something that looks an awful lot like what the Hahn family pulled off their riverbank. Then there's the chlorine, which sounds exotic until you remember the hammer was sitting in Texas groundwater, which is famously loaded with chloride salts. Iron, sitting in salty water for a century, absorbs chlorine. That's not weird chemistry, that's just chemistry. So the skeptics have a clean, boring, very plausible explanation. Lost mining tool, encased by natural processes, found by accident, mythologized by a museum that needs the earth to be young. Case closed. Well, almost. Because here's the awkward part nobody on either side likes to admit. The hammer has never actually been independently tested. No radiocarbon dating on the wooden handle, no proper geological analysis of the surrounding stone. The owner of the museum where it sits, Carl Bohr, whose entire institution is built around the idea that humans walked with dinosaurs, has consistently refused to allow outside scientists to examine it. Skeptics say he's hiding it because he knows the truth would kill the legend. True believers say science is afraid of what it might find. So both camps dig in, neither can finish the argument, and the hammer just sits there behind glass, doing nothing. This would all be a quirky Texas roadside attraction if the London hammer were the only object like it. It isn't. In 1885, in a small town in Austria, a coal worker split open a chunk of brown coal. Coal dated to the Tertiary period, somewhere between 2 and 65 million years old, and a small iron cube fell out, almost a perfect cube, with a deep groove cut around its middle, too symmetrical to be natural, too out of place to be modern. It was called the Salzburg Cube, and for nearly a century it was held up as proof of intelligent life on Earth millions of years before us. It was, eventually, identified as a counterweight from 19th century mining equipment that had fallen into a coal seam during excavation. But here's the thing, that explanation came decades after the artifact had already gone viral in books, magazines, and eventually websites. The myth always travels faster than the correction. In 1901, Greek sponge divers off the island of Antikythera pulled a corroded lump of bronze out of an ancient Roman shipwreck. Nobody thought much of it at first, then someone cleaned it. And inside were more than 30 meshing bronze gears machined to tolerances that shouldn't have been possible until at least 1400 years later. The Antikythera mechanism, as we now call it, is an analog computer. It tracked the sun, the moon, 5 planets, eclipse cycles, even the irregularities in the moon's orbit. Built around 100 BC, lost at sea, forgotten, not replicated by Europe until roughly the 14th century maybe. And here's what Antikythera teaches us, and it's important. Technological progress is not a straight line. We tell ourselves a story where humans climb steadily from stone tools to iPhones, but the actual record is jagged. Civilizations rise, they invent, they collapse, and drag their inventions into the grave with them. The Romans had concrete that lasted 2,000 years, and we lost the recipe for over a millennium. Damascus steel, Greek fire, the recipes are gone. The ancients knew things we now have to reverse engineer. But, and this is critical, there is a massive canyon between the Greeks were smarter than we thought and an industrial civilization existed 300,000 years ago. Antikythera is a marvel. It's not a hammer in stone. In South Africa, miners have spent decades pulling small metallic spheres out of pyrophyllite deposits roughly 2.5 billion years old. Smooth. Some of them grooved around the equator like they'd been lathe-turned. They went viral in the 70s. They turned out to be natural concretions. The grooves are mineral layering. Nature does that. Nature also makes hexagonal basalt columns and perfectly symmetrical snowflakes. Symmetry is not a signature of intelligence. The Baghdad batteries, clay jars with copper cylinders and iron rods inside, capable of generating a small voltage when filled with vinegar, those are real, and they're roughly 2,000 years old, and we genuinely don't know what they were for. Maybe electroplating jewelry, maybe just holding sacred scrolls, and the electricity is a happy accident. The scholarly debate is unresolved, so that one stays on the shelf marked interesting. You start to see the pattern. Most of these impossible artifacts have boring explanations the moment a real scientist gets near them. A few are genuinely strange. None of them, individually, is enough to rewrite the history of the human species. But, and I want you to stay with me here, because the alternative history crowd makes one argument that actually deserves a fair hearing. The argument is this: if you find one out-of-place coin on the ocean floor, that's nothing. If you find 10, that's a coincidence. If you find 100, there's a shipwreck down there. The question is whether we've found the 100 yet. Skeptics correctly say no. Most of these artifacts come from the 19th or early 20th century, before modern excavation standards, with no photographs, no documented context, and a long chain of retellings. There's also a brutal selection effect at play. Nobody makes a documentary called The Mystery That Turned Out to Be a Mining Tool, but the 300,000-year-old hammer pulls 10 million views. So we hear about the unsolved cases over and over, and the solved ones disappear. The strongest skeptical argument, though, is also the simplest. If there had been a technological civilization on Earth 300,000 years ago, we would not have found a hammer. We would have found everything. Building foundations, mining waste piles, atmospheric isotopes locked in glacial ice, microplastics in deep sediment. Our civilization is barely a few thousand years old, and our fingerprints are already everywhere. From radioactive isotopes in Antarctic ice cores to plastic fragments in the deepest ocean trenches. A civilization that lasted hundreds of thousands of years should be vastly more visible than ours, and we don't see it. One hammer is an anomaly. The total absence of everything else is a refutation, and for decades, that's where the story ended, until 2018. In April of that year, a climate scientist named Gavin Schmidt, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, very much not a fringe figure, co-authored a paper with astrobiologist Adam Frank. They titled it The Silurian Hypothesis. The name comes from a race of intelligent reptiles in Doctor Who. The science inside it does not. The paper asked a question nobody in mainstream geology had really put on paper before. Imagine, hypothetically, that a non-human industrial civilization existed on Earth deep in geological time, say 50 million years ago. Would we even be able to tell? Their answer was, probably not. Not from buildings, not from skeletons, not from technology. After 10 million years, concrete is dust. Plastic has decomposed. Steel has oxidized into iron stains in mudstone. Bones are gone. Cities become a thin chemical smudge in a layer of rock no one would think to dig. But, and this is the part that should put a chill on the back of your neck, there would be subtle signatures, anomalous spikes in carbon isotopes, the kind that come from burning fossil fuels, strange concentrations of synthetic chemicals, disruptions in nitrogen cycles that don't match any natural event. Hints, whispers, patterns, nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking. And here's the kicker, we aren't specifically looking. Modern geology is built around finding fossils and minerals, not industrial fingerprints from an extinct intelligence. The Silurian Hypothesis isn't a claim that any of this happened, it's a methodological challenge. Schmidt and Frank are essentially asking, are we sure our search is good enough to rule it out? And the answer they land on, very politely, is no. Which brings us all the way back to the hammer. Is the London hammer evidence of a lost civilization? Almost certainly not. The boring explanation, a 19th century mining tool encased in mineral concretion, is, by Occam's razor, almost certainly the right one. But should it be properly tested? Yes, and it hasn't been. Which is why, after all these years, it stays exactly what it's been since 1947, a Rorschach test that everyone projects their own beliefs onto. Creationists see a young Earth. Alternative historians see a lost age. Skeptics see a hardware store relic in a fancy shell. Scientists, when they think about it at all, see a reminder that even the simplest looking objects can be more complicated than they appear. And maybe that's the actual point of all this. We live on a planet that is 4.5 billion years old. Our written history covers maybe 5,000 of those years. We have studied a fraction of the Earth's crust, the deep ocean, the polar ice. To stand on top of that towering iceberg of ignorance and announce that we know everything about the past, that's not science, that's hubris. Here's the thought I want to leave you with. If our civilization disappeared tomorrow, an intelligent species 10 million years from now would find us everywhere. Plastic in every sediment layer, concrete skeletons of cities, nuclear isotopes burned into the rock, satellites still orbiting silently overhead. They would have no doubt that we existed. But if a civilization existed before us without plastic, without nuclear power, without concrete, what would survive? What would they leave behind? Maybe just one weird hammer in a riverbank in Texas that nobody could quite explain. The London hammer probably isn't proof of anything, but the unsettling thing, the part that keeps it interesting long after every reasonable explanation has been offered, isn't the hammer itself, it's the question it forces us to sit with. 4.5 billion years is a very, very long time, and our knowledge of it is a thin, fragile film floating on top of an ocean we have barely begun to map. So, where do you land? Lost civilization, lost mining tool, or something we don't have a name for yet? Drop your verdict in the comments. I read them. I'll see you in the next one.